The Near East at the end of the 12th century was a landscape shaped as much by memory as by stone. Roads followed the lines of ancient empires, yet the powers that claimed them were newer, provisional, and uncertain of their permanence. Jerusalem stood at the center of this world, not because of its size or wealth, but because of what generations believed it represented. For Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, the city carried layers of sacred meaning that could not be separated from political authority. Control of Jerusalem conferred legitimacy that extended beyond armies and borders, turning the city into a measure of divine favor as much as territorial power. The crusader states that surrounded Jerusalem had endured for nearly a century, sustained by fortifications, religious conviction, and intermittent reinforcement from Europe. Their castles dominated ridgelines and passes, projecting strength across a hostile landscape. Yet beneath their walls lay persistent fragility. Leadership was divided by rival claims, shifting regencies, and personal feuds that weakened collective resolve. Resources were finite, manpower scarce, and alliances unreliable. Survival depended less on conquest than on maintaining a delicate balance between vigilance and negotiation in a region that offered little margin for error. Beyond the borders of the Crusader states stretched a Muslim world still marked by division. Political authority was fragmented among rival dynasties, competing cities, and ambitious commanders who owed loyalty as much to circumstance as to ideology. Memories of earlier unity under powerful rulers lingered, but they no longer reflected reality. Egypt and Syria followed separate paths, often more concerned with each other than with the Christian presence along the coast. This fragmentation had allowed the Crusader states to persist far longer than their limited numbers should have permitted. War had become a constant condition rather than an exceptional event. Raids crossed borders with regularity, punctuated by uneasy truces that rarely outlived the men who negotiated them. Farmers worked fields within sight of walls, uncertain whether harvest or flight would define the coming season. Pilgrims moved cautiously along roads that could shift from safe passage to ambush within a day. Violence existed alongside commerce and diplomacy, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Generations grew to adulthood knowing no clear distinction between peace and war. Jerusalem itself embodied this tension. Its streets held Christian processions, Muslim prayers, and Jewish memory within the same confined space. The city was administered as a Christian capital, yet its population remained religiously diverse, governed through systems that balanced tolerance with control. Sacred sites drew devotion and resentment in equal measure, reminding all who entered that authority here was never merely administrative. Every ritual, tax, and guard post reinforced the idea that Jerusalem was both prize and provocation. Within this environment emerged a generation shaped by prolonged conflict. Leaders came of age not in moments of founding triumph, but amid inherited uncertainty. They learned to rule in a world where stability was provisional and legitimacy constantly tested. Authority depended on the ability to navigate alliances, suppress rivals, and respond to threats that could emerge from any direction. War was not an interruption to governance, but one of its defining instruments. The Crusader nobility, many born in the Levant rather than Europe, had adapted to the realities of frontier rule. They spoke local languages, negotiated with neighboring rulers, and understood the terrain intimately. Yet their identity remained tied to distant homelands and religious commitments that shaped their political decisions. Appeals to Europe for aid reflected both confidence in shared faith and anxiety over isolation. Each generation faced the same question of whether the Crusader states were temporary outposts or permanent realms. Across Muslim territories, similar questions of legitimacy and unity persisted. Rulers balanced religious obligation with pragmatic governance, aware that calls for holy war carried expectations that could be difficult to satisfy. The presence of Christian states on formerly Muslim land remained a source of grievance, but the means to address it were neither unified nor consistent. Ideological pressure existed, but it competed with local priorities and rival ambitions. The Near East thus existed in a condition of suspended resolution. No single power possessed the strength to impose lasting order, yet none could ignore the pressures building around Jerusalem. Each truce deferred rather than resolved underlying conflict. Each generation inherited grievances sharpened by memory and reinforced by experience. The land itself bore the marks of repeated campaigns, its fortresses repaired and rebuilt, its roads worn by armies moving without final purpose. This was not a world awaiting sudden upheaval, but one gradually narrowing its options. Political fragmentation, religious conviction, and strategic necessity combined to limit the range of possible futures. Decisions taken to preserve stability often undermined it instead, creating patterns of response that hardened over time. By the late 12th century, the balance that had sustained the Crusader states and restrained their neighbors showed signs of strain that could not be concealed by walls or diplomacy. Jerusalem remained at the center of these pressures, its significance amplifying every local dispute into a broader contest. Control of the city was inseparable from claims about divine order and rightful rule. As long as it stood under Christian authority, the question of legitimacy remained open, unresolved by decades of coexistence and conflict. The Near East moved forward under the weight of this unresolved tension, shaped by a past that refused to fade and a future increasingly constrained by choices already made. No single moment announced transformation. The region advanced through habit, obligation, and inherited fear, guided by precedent rather than vision. Leaders responded to immediate necessity, rarely imagining outcomes beyond survival. Patience and restraint carried risks, while decisive action threatened consequences beyond calculation. The Near East continued forward under these conditions, not toward resolution, but toward convergence, shaped by memory, pressure, belief, geography, fatigue, loyalty, fear, and the slow erosion of alternatives. Saladin entered history through institutions rather than upheaval. His early life unfolded within a world already structured by hierarchy, patronage, and expectation, where power was learned slowly and exercised cautiously. Born into a Kurdish family of military administrators, he did not inherit a throne or command armies by right. Instead, his position was defined by service to those who did. This formative environment trained him to observe before acting, to listen before commanding, and to understand that authority, once seized prematurely, was often short-lived. His youth coincided with a broader transformation underway in the Islamic Near East. Decades of political fragmentation had eroded confidence in leadership, while the continued presence of Christian states sharpened debates over legitimacy and religious obligation. Sunni revivalism, promoted by scholars and rulers alike, sought to restore moral clarity and political cohesion through religious orthodoxy. This movement did not simply demand belief, it demanded discipline, personal conduct, and visible restraint from those who governed. Saladin absorbed these expectations not as abstractions, but as professional requirements within the courts he served. Service placed him under the authority of men shaped by ambition and caution in equal measure. His uncle, Shirkuh, a seasoned commander, embodied the volatility of military life, where advancement depended on initiative tempered by loyalty. Campaigns in Egypt exposed Saladin to the mechanics of war without granting him autonomy. He learned logistics, negotiation, and the management of troops not as a visionary leader, but as a subordinate responsible for execution rather than strategy. These years instilled an understanding of power as something exercised collectively and constrained by circumstance. Egypt itself presented a complex arena. Governed by the declining Fatimid Caliphate, it stood at the intersection of ideological rivalry and strategic necessity. Sunni commanders operating in a Shia court navigated suspicion, ritual difference, and competing loyalties. Saladin's conduct during this period was marked by restraint rather than confrontation. He avoided public displays of ideological zeal, focusing instead on administrative stability and military readiness. This approach preserved order while gradually shifting the balance of authority, demonstrating a preference for gradual transformation over sudden rupture. When circumstances elevated him to positions of greater responsibility, Saladin's instincts remained cautious. Power came to him incrementally, shaped by necessity rather than ambition openly declared. He assumed roles others hesitated to fill, often inheriting problems created by faster, less patient men. His leadership style reflected the moral expectations of the Sunni revival: personal piety, moderation in conduct, and a visible concern for justice. These qualities earned trust within scholarly circles and legitimacy among soldiers who valued consistency over charisma. Yet restraint did not equate to passivity. Saladin understood the pressures facing the Muslim world and the symbolic weight carried by the crusader states. He recognized that fragmentation weakened collective defense and invited perpetual vulnerability. Still, he resisted premature calls for decisive confrontation. Experience had taught him that unity imposed too quickly dissolved just as fast. His focus remained on consolidation, loyalty, and the careful alignment of religious obligation with political reality. Court politics further refined this approach. Saladin operated in environments where alliances shifted with health, succession, and rumor. Survival required discretion, patience, and the ability to read intention without provoking response. He learned when to advance and when to yield, when silence preserved advantage better than argument. These habits shaped a leader attuned to consequence, wary of overextension, and aware that legitimacy depended as much on perception as on force. Personal ambition, when present, was disciplined rather than expansive. Saladin's contemporaries often noted his avoidance of extravagance and his preference for a measured public presence. He cultivated an image aligned with moral seriousness, reinforcing the idea that leadership in an age of religious war demanded visible self-control. This was not mere performance. In a world where rulers were judged by their adherence to religious norms, restraint functioned as both ethical commitment and political strategy. As his authority expanded across Egypt and into Syria, Saladin faced the challenge of unifying territories accustomed to autonomy. He approached this task through negotiation, shared interest, and appeals to collective obligation rather than coercion alone. Resistance was met with persistence rather than brutality, reinforcing his reputation as a ruler who sought stability over spectacle. Each consolidation reduced fragmentation while avoiding the backlash that sudden domination might provoke. By the time Saladin emerged as a central figure in the Near East, his identity was firmly shaped by these formative experiences. He was not a conqueror forged in decisive battle, but an administrator and commander trained in patience. His worldview reflected a belief that moral authority and political power were inseparable, and that one undermined the other when exercised without restraint. This perspective would later distinguish his actions in moments of victory as much as in periods of preparation. History often remembers leaders by their climactic achievements, but Saladin's character was formed long before those moments arrived. His rise through service, discipline, and restraint created a ruler capable of bearing responsibility without haste. In an age defined by religious war and political instability, these qualities positioned him to respond to pressures that demanded not only strength, but judgment. The world he inherited required a leader shaped by limitation as much as by ambition, and Saladin had learned both through years of deliberate apprenticeship. The consolidation of Egypt and Syria under Saladin altered the political balance of the Near East, not through sudden conquest, but through the gradual removal of uncertainty. For decades, fragmentation among Muslim rulers had created a landscape in which the crusader states could survive despite their demographic and geographic vulnerability. Division functioned as an unspoken shield, preventing any single power from concentrating the resources necessary to challenge their position. As Saladin extended his authority, that shield began to thin, replaced by a new and unsettling clarity. Unity, however, was not an uncomplicated good. For many Muslim rulers, the rise of a dominant authority threatened local autonomy as much as it promised collective security. Cities accustomed to negotiating their own survival faced the prospect of subordination to a distant center. Alliances were weighed carefully, not only against the Christian presence, but against the ambitions of neighbors who now claimed legitimacy through shared faith and purpose. Political survival depended on choosing when to resist, when to submit, and when to delay. Saladin understood these tensions intimately. His consolidation relied less on force than on patience, calculated generosity, and the careful framing of obligation. He presented unity not as conquest, but as restoration, aligning his expansion with the moral language of Sunni revivalism. Yet beneath this rhetoric lay real consequences. Each territory brought under his influence reduced the flexibility that fragmentation had allowed. Borders hardened, loyalties clarified, and the possibility of neutral coexistence diminished. For the crusader states, these changes were impossible to ignore. Their endurance had always depended on divisions beyond their walls. Muslim rivalries allowed them to play one power against another, to negotiate truces that relieved pressure while awaiting reinforcements from Europe. As Saladin's authority expanded, these strategies grew less effective. Diplomacy that once exploited rivalry now encountered coordinated response. Raids that once provoked limited retaliation began to carry broader consequences. Yet the Crusader leadership was itself divided. Internal disputes over succession, territory, and authority weakened collective response to the changing landscape. Some viewed Saladin's rise as a temporary alignment that would fracture under pressure, as so many before it had. Others recognized the emerging threat but lacked consensus on how to address it. Calls for unity within the Crusader states echoed the very pressures reshaping their adversaries, revealing parallel vulnerabilities masked by opposing faiths. Ideological pressure intensified alongside political change. Sunni scholars increasingly framed unity as religious obligation, arguing that continued division enabled occupation of sacred land. Sermons and legal opinions reinforced the idea that coexistence under current conditions was a failure of leadership. This language did not dictate immediate action, but it narrowed acceptable choices. Delay became harder to justify, restraint more difficult to defend. Political caution risked being interpreted as moral weakness. Saladin navigated these pressures carefully. He avoided premature declarations of holy war, aware that such rhetoric could outpace preparation. Instead, he focused on consolidating loyalty and ensuring administrative stability. His approach reflected an understanding that unity imposed without capacity would collapse under its own weight. Nevertheless, each step toward consolidation increased expectations that unity would be used for its stated purpose. Regional rivalries did not disappear, they adapted. Some rulers submitted reluctantly, calculating that alignment offered better survival than isolation. Others resisted quietly, waiting for signs of overreach. These dynamics created an environment of watchful tension, where every campaign and treaty was evaluated for its implications beyond immediate gain. The Near East moved closer to confrontation not through a single decision, but through the gradual alignment of incentives and fears. The Crusader states responded unevenly. Fortifications were strengthened. patrols increased, and diplomatic missions dispatched to Europe. Yet these measures addressed symptoms rather than cause. The underlying reality remained unchanged. A unified adversary reduced the margin for error upon which crusader survival depended. Even peaceful years carried an edge of anticipation, as leaders understood that stability rested on conditions increasingly beyond their control. Coexistence, once maintained through fragmentation and pragmatism, grew more fragile. Truces became more formal and more brittle, tested by incidents that might once have been contained. The symbolic importance of Jerusalem amplified these tensions, transforming local disputes into matters of collective honor. Every caravan attacked, every truce violated, reverberated through a network of alliances now more tightly bound. As unity advanced, neutrality eroded. Regions that once balanced between powers found themselves compelled to choose sides. Trade routes became political statements, and silence could be interpreted as defiance. The Near East began to resemble a system under compression, its components increasingly unable to move independently without affecting the whole. Saladin did not seek confrontation for its own sake. His actions reflected an awareness that unity altered not only external threats, but internal responsibility. Leadership now carried the burden of expectation, and restraint risked disappointing those who believed unity existed for action. Yet haste risked undermining the very stability he had worked to create. This balance defined his position as much as any battlefield. By the late 12th century, the Near East existed in a state where division could no longer sustain coexistence, and unity could not avoid consequence. The structures that had permitted parallel survival were giving way to pressures that demanded resolution. Choices narrowed, not because leaders desired conflict, but because the conditions that once deferred it were disappearing. The world Saladin shaped was one in which fragmentation could no longer contain the meaning of Jerusalem, and unity made its continued division increasingly impossible. The language of holy war had long circulated through the Near East, but for much of the 12th century it functioned more as aspiration than command. Rulers invoked it selectively, scholars debated its conditions, and populations lived with its vocabulary without seeing it fully realized. It existed alongside truces, negotiations, and accommodations that reflected the realities of fragmented power. Yet, as political conditions shifted, that language began to change in weight. What had once justified action now began to demand it. Raids played a central role in this transformation. Along contested frontiers, small-scale violence was routine, often conducted for material gain rather than ideological purpose. Livestock taken, villages burned, prisoners exchanged or sold. These acts rarely altered the broader balance. Yet over time, repetition hardened perception. Each raid reinforced the sense that peace was provisional and conditional, sustained only so long as force remained restrained. When violence crossed symbolic thresholds, its meaning expanded beyond its immediate scale. Pilgrims and caravans occupied a particular place within this system. Their movement represented not only commerce and devotion, but also the assumption of order. Truces were often defined by their protection, signaling a shared interest in stability despite enmity. When such guarantees were violated, the damage exceeded material loss. Attacks on pilgrims and merchants challenged the credibility of agreements themselves, transforming breaches of conduct into moral indictments. These violations did not always originate from centralized command. Ambitious crusader lords, operating at the edges of authority, tested boundaries through provocation. Their actions reflected impatience with restraint and confidence that retaliation could be managed or localized. Yet each incident reverberated beyond its origin, carried through reports, sermons, and diplomatic exchanges. What might have been dismissed as banditry became framed as deliberate insult, accumulating into a narrative of bad faith. For Muslim audiences, these provocations sharpened existing grievances. The continued Christian presence in Jerusalem already represented unresolved injustice. Attacks on pilgrims added a personal dimension, transforming abstract loss into lived violation. Scholars and preachers increasingly emphasized obligation over prudence, arguing that restraint in the face of repeated provocation undermined moral authority. The language of holy war narrowed the space for compromise by redefining patience as complicity. Saladin stood at the center of this shifting logic. His authority rested not only on military strength, but on the perception that he embodied the moral expectations of leadership. As unity advanced, so too did scrutiny. Actions once praised as measured began to appear insufficient. Each report of violation placed him in a position where response was weighed not merely by outcome, but by intention. To delay risked appearing indifferent to suffering and dishonor. Yet restraint had shaped his rise. Saladin understood the cost of action taken without preparation, the instability created by campaigns launched for symbolism rather than necessity. He had seen unity collapse under the weight of premature expectation. His instinct remained to absorb pressure, to consolidate before committing. But the environment in which he operated was changing. Legitimacy now carried a temporal dimension. Authority was measured not only by judgment, but by responsiveness. Broken truces accelerated this shift. Agreements once extended through mutual interest now collapsed under accumulated mistrust. Each side interpreted violations through the lens of inevitability, assuming future betrayal regardless of present restraint. Diplomacy lost elasticity, its terms hardened by memory rather than opportunity. The Near East moved from a pattern of episodic violence toward sustained confrontation, driven by the belief that coexistence had been exhausted. The logic of holy war imposed clarity at the cost of flexibility. It simplified choices by moralizing them, reducing complex political calculations to questions of duty and failure. For leaders, this clarity offered legitimacy but removed insulation. Decisions became public statements of belief rather than tactical adjustments. The consequences of action and inaction alike expanded, judged by audiences far beyond the battlefield. Saladin's position became increasingly constrained. Unity had elevated him as the focal point of collective expectation. Where once responsibility could be diffused among rival rulers, it now converged. Appeals reached him from scholars, commanders, and populations who viewed unity as a means rather than an end. Each appeal narrowed his margin for delay, aligning moral argument with strategic reality. Escalation followed not from a single decree, but from the convergence of incident, interpretation, and obligation. Raids provoked retaliation. Retaliation justified broader preparation, and preparation signaled intent. The cycle reinforced itself, transforming the possibility of restraint into a liability. Even caution required justification, and justification grew harder to sustain as pressure mounted. By this stage, the conflict was no longer defined solely by territory or advantage. It had assumed an existential dimension shaped by belief, memory, and accumulated grievance. Jerusalem's significance magnified every action, ensuring that local incidents carried universal meaning. The Near East moved toward confrontation not through sudden resolve, but through the erosion of alternatives. Delay, once a strategy, came to resemble evasion. Restraint, once a virtue, risked being read as failure. Saladin stood within this narrowing field, aware that action would bring consequences he could not fully control, yet conscious that inaction would redefine his authority. The logic of holy war did not demand immediate battle, but it reordered the moral landscape in which decisions were made. From this point forward, conflict was no longer a matter of choice deferred, but of obligation accumulating, shaping a path that could no longer be avoided, without cost to legitimacy itself. The confrontation that would determine the fate of the Crusader states did not begin with siege engines or walls under assault, but with movement across an unforgiving landscape. In the summer of 1187, armies gathered not around Jerusalem, but in the dry hills and plains of Galilee, where water dictated strategy as much as steel. The land offered little shelter from heat, its paths exposed and its springs few. Decisions made here would be measured not only in tactical terms, but in endurance, discipline, and the ability to impose order on exhaustion. Saladin approached this moment with preparation rather than urgency. His forces had been assembled deliberately, supplied through networks refined during years of consolidation. Commanders understood their roles, and movement was coordinated to control access to water and space. The objective was not immediate destruction, but containment. By shaping the environment in which battle would occur, Saladin sought to reduce uncertainty and force his adversary into decisions under strain. The Crusader leadership faced a narrowing set of options. Reports of Muslim forces threatening Tiberias demanded response, yet the path to relief crossed exposed terrain. Debate within the Crusader camp reflected deeper divisions, whether to remain near reliable water or advance to confront Saladin directly. Pressure to act came not only from military necessity, but from honor, obligation, and fear of appearing passive. Ultimately, the decision to march placed the army's survival in the balance. As the Crusader host moved eastward, heat and thirst began to erode cohesion. Heavy armor designed for shock combat became a burden under the sun. Horses weakened, formations stretched, and the pace slowed. Saladin's forces harassed the column, avoiding decisive engagement while denying rest and water. Smoke from fires set in dry grass added to confusion, reducing visibility and increasing panic. Each hour compounded physical strain with psychological pressure. By the time the armies converged near the horns of Hattin, the Crusader force was already compromised. Discipline faltered as thirst overrode command. Attempts to break through to water sources were repelled, and coordination between units deteriorated. What had been a formidable army became a collection of exhausted contingents, struggling to maintain formation under continuous harassment. Saladin's strategy had transformed terrain and time into weapons. The battle itself unfolded as a series of collapses rather than a single clash. Crusader infantry, weakened and disoriented, could not sustain defense against sustained pressure. Cavalry charges, once decisive, lacked momentum and coordination. Saladin's forces exploited these failures methodically, closing gaps and isolating units. Commanders who attempted to rally resistance found their authority undermined by physical exhaustion and the absence of viable alternatives. Capture followed defeat. Key Crusader leaders were taken alive, their authority extinguished along with their armies. The relic of the True Cross, carried into battle as a symbol of divine favor, was seized, its loss reverberating far beyond the field. This moment carried symbolic weight equal to its military consequence, signaling that belief alone could not compensate for strategic failure. Hattin did not destroy the Crusader states in a single stroke, but it removed the foundation upon which their survival depended. Armies could be raised again, castles still stood, but the capacity to resist coordinated assault was gone. The psychological impact was immediate. News of defeat spread quickly, undermining morale and prompting cities to reassess their prospects. Resistance became a calculation rather than an assumption. Saladin responded to victory with restraint rather than spectacle. He avoided unnecessary destruction, focusing instead on consolidating gains and preserving momentum. Cities fell through negotiation as often as force, their defenders aware that relief was unlikely. The logic of Hattin extended beyond the battlefield, shaping decisions across the region. What had once seemed a contest of endurance now appeared resolved in principle. For Jerusalem, the implications were unmistakable. Its defenses remained intact, but the network of support that sustained them had been shattered. Without a field army capable of challenge, the city's fate depended on time rather than possibility. Hattin marked the moment when the survival of Crusader Jerusalem ceased to be a strategic question and became a temporal one. The battle near Hattin thus functioned as more than a military engagement. It represented the culmination of pressures built over decades: unity replacing fragmentation, discipline countering improvisation, and preparation overcoming faith untempered by strategy. The Crusader states had relied on endurance and division beyond their borders. At Hattin, those conditions collapsed under the weight of coordinated force. In the aftermath, the Near East entered a new phase. The balance that had sustained coexistence was broken, replaced by a clarity that left little room for reversal. Saladin's victory did not conclude the conflict, but it defined its trajectory. From this point forward, events would unfold not around whether Crusader power could be preserved, but around how its remaining structures would respond to inevitable pressure. The aftermath of Hattin did not produce a rush toward Jerusalem, nor did it inspire displays of triumph that might have accompanied such a decisive victory. Instead, Saladin advanced with deliberation, aware that momentum could be squandered as easily as it could be gained. The destruction of the Crusader field army had altered the strategic landscape, but it had not erased the physical presence of Crusader power. Castles still dominated roads and passes, and cities remained fortified behind walls built to withstand prolonged siege. What had changed was not their material strength, but their position within a collapsing system. Saladin's movements reflected this understanding. He divided his attention between speed and stability, avoiding the temptation to strike directly at the symbolic center before the surrounding structure had been dismantled. Each advance was calculated to reduce Crusader options rather than provoke desperate resistance. Garrisons isolated by the loss of external support now faced choices that could not be deferred indefinitely. Relief was unlikely, coordination impossible, and the cost of defiance increasingly clear. Negotiation became as decisive as force. Towns that once relied on the prospect of Crusader counterattack reassessed their position in light of Hattin's consequences. Envoys traveled cautiously between camps, carrying terms rather than threats. Saladin's reputation for restraint encouraged surrender without destruction, reinforcing the logic that accommodation offered survival, where resistance promised only delay. These negotiations were not acts of mercy alone. They were instruments of efficiency, preserving resources and time. As cities fell, the process reinforced itself. Each surrender reduced the remaining network of Crusader control, tightening the ring around Jerusalem. Roads that once carried supplies and reinforcements shifted into Muslim hands, transforming distance into isolation. Fortresses that had served as anchors of authority now stood disconnected, their garrisons forced to weigh honor against endurance. The unraveling proceeded not through chaos, but through calculation repeated across the landscape. Saladin's command structure emphasized coordination and discipline. Forces moved with attention to supply and communication, avoiding the overextension that had undone previous campaigns in the region. Victories were consolidated before new advances began, ensuring that gains did not become liabilities. This methodical pace reflected lessons learned from years of restraint, where patience had preserved unity and preparation had guarded against collapse. For the Crusader population, the experience was one of progressive contraction. News traveled faster than armies, carrying reports of surrendered cities and negotiated terms. Morale eroded as the sense of inevitability spread. Decisions once framed as temporary concessions became permanent recalculations of survival. The absence of a crusader field army meant that resistance no longer implied hope of reversal, only postponement. Jerusalem felt these changes before any siege lines appeared. The city's leaders understood that its strength lay not only in walls, but in connection. Pilgrims, traders, and messengers had once linked it to a broader crusader world. As those links dissolved, Jerusalem became a solitary stronghold, sustained by memory and faith rather than practical support. The city remained formidable, but its isolation deepened with each passing week. Saladin did not exploit this isolation through terror. He allowed the logic of circumstance to work in his favor. By securing surrounding territories and ensuring orderly transitions of power, he reduced the likelihood of desperate measures that could complicate the final approach. His restraint communicated confidence, suggesting that time favored his position. This confidence shaped the choices of those who still held out, reinforcing the perception that resistance was no longer a strategic option. The pace of advance also managed expectation within Saladin's own ranks. Victory at Hattin had generated enthusiasm, but unchecked momentum risked indiscipline and fragmentation. By emphasizing order and negotiation, Saladin maintained cohesion and reaffirmed the principles that had guided his rise. Soldiers were reminded that success depended not on spectacle, but on consistency and control. As the road to Jerusalem narrowed, the conflict entered a quieter phase, marked less by battle than by reassessment. Each surrendered city represented a calculation made under pressure, yet free from immediate violence. This pattern distinguished Saladin's campaign from earlier conquests in the region, where rapid advances often provoked cycles of rebellion and repression. Here, the emphasis remained on permanence rather than demonstration. Jerusalem's defenders watched this progression with increasing clarity. The city had endured before, relying on the resilience of its walls and the hope of intervention. Now, those hopes thinned as surrounding territories passed into Muslim control without catastrophic loss. The absence of chaos underscored the seriousness of the situation. There was no dramatic collapse to rally against, only the steady withdrawal of possibility. By the time Saladin turned his full attention toward Jerusalem, the city's fate had been shaped by events beyond its walls. Its isolation was the product of systematic dismantling rather than sudden assault. The road to Jerusalem had not been marked by devastation, but by decisions made under the weight of inevitability. Saladin's restraint ensured that when the city finally faced him, it did so as the last remaining piece of a structure already undone. This phase of the campaign revealed the depth of Saladin's strategy. Victory was not pursued as an emotional culmination, but as a responsibility, requiring patience and control. The unraveling of crusader power proceeded without excess, guided by the understanding that legitimacy depended on what followed conquest as much as on conquest itself. Jerusalem stood ahead, intact yet alone, its significance unchanged, but its circumstances transformed by a road shaped not by chaos, but by deliberate consequence. Jerusalem did not fall in a storm of violence. When Saladin's forces arrived before its walls in the autumn of 1187, the city stood intact, crowded, and heavy with memory. Its stones carried the weight of centuries, but one memory overshadowed all others. The capture of 1099, when Crusader forces had taken the city with slaughter that echoed across the Islamic world for generations. That past shaped every calculation now made within and around the city. Jerusalem was not only a military objective, but a moral test whose outcome would be measured against remembered atrocity. Inside the walls, fear did not express itself as panic, but as exhaustion and clarity. The city's defenders understood their position. There was no field army to relieve them, No network of allied strongholds to break a siege. Refugees from fallen towns crowded the streets, bringing first-hand accounts of Saladin's advance. These accounts did not speak of indiscriminate destruction, but they did confirm the permanence of change. The question facing Jerusalem's leaders was not how to defeat Saladin, but how to shape surrender in a way that preserved life and dignity. Saladin approached the city without haste. Siege preparations were deliberate, calculated to demonstrate capability rather than provoke despair. Engines were constructed, positions secured, and supply lines maintained. The display of order mattered. Jerusalem was watching not only with fear, but with expectation shaped by history. The conduct of the besieging army would define how conquest itself would be remembered. Negotiations began early, reflecting mutual recognition of reality. Jerusalem's leaders appealed to precedent, invoking the sacredness of the city and the potential consequences of violence. Saladin listened, aware that his response would resonate far beyond the immediate exchange. He carried the burden of comparison with 1099, a comparison no Muslim ruler confronting Jerusalem could escape. Victory here would be judged not by possession alone, but by conduct. The memory of massacre functioned as both warning and opportunity. For Jerusalem's defenders, it underscored the stakes of surrender. For Saladin, it presented a chance to redefine conquest under the logic of holy war. He had risen under the expectations of moral leadership, and now those expectations converged upon this moment. The legitimacy he had cultivated through restraint and discipline would be tested not in battle, but in mercy. Terms were negotiated under pressure, but not in chaos. Ransom replaced slaughter as the currency of surrender. Lives could be redeemed rather than extinguished, families allowed to leave rather than perish. These arrangements required administration, patience, and enforcement. Mercy, in this context, was not spontaneous compassion, but deliberate policy. It imposed order where vengeance might have been easier. The city surrendered without breach. When Saladin entered Jerusalem, it was not as a conqueror riding through ruins, but as a ruler assuming responsibility for a living city. Churches and mosques stood side by side, their preservation reinforcing the message that authority had changed without annihilation. Sacred sites were secured, rituals regulated, and violence constrained. The transition unfolded under supervision, its success dependent on discipline among soldiers and clarity of command. For those leaving the city, the experience was defined by loss tempered by survival. Ransom did not erase displacement, nor did mercy remove grief. Yet the absence of mass violence distinguished this moment from the city's remembered past. News of Jerusalem's fall traveled quickly, carried by survivors who bore witness not only to defeat, but to restraint. These accounts reshaped expectations across the region, altering how conquest could be imagined. Saladin's decisions carried risk. Mercy could be interpreted as weakness, restraint as missed opportunity. He was aware that his actions would be scrutinized by allies and rivals alike. Yet he accepted this risk, understanding that legitimacy gained through terror was fragile. By imposing order, he reinforced the moral framework that had justified unity and struggle in the first place. Jerusalem's capture became not merely an endpoint, but a demonstration of principle. Emotion at this moment was not released through celebration. Saladin himself is recorded as subdued rather than triumphant, conscious of the responsibility now attached to possession of the city. Jerusalem's meaning demanded restraint from its ruler as much as reverence from its inhabitants. Victory here expanded obligation rather than concluding effort. The highest emotional gravity of the campaign resided in this quiet transformation. Expectations, shaped by centuries of conflict, were confounded by an outcome that resisted spectacle. There were no streets running with blood, no deliberate erasure of the defeated. Instead, there was administration, negotiation, and controlled transition. The city passed from one authority to another without losing its essential fabric. This restraint did not erase the reality of conquest. Jerusalem was taken, its Christian rulers displaced, its political status transformed. Yet the manner of its taking altered the moral narrative surrounding holy war. Violence had not been denied, but it had been bounded. Memory, rather than being fed, was confronted and redirected. In this moment, Saladin's long formation revealed its purpose. Years of discipline, patience, and moral positioning converged upon a decision that would define his legacy as much as any battlefield victory. Jerusalem did not fall because it was destroyed, but because it was absorbed into a new order that sought legitimacy through control rather than annihilation. The city remained, changed but intact, carrying forward its layered meanings under new authority. Saladin's victory did not close the chapter of conflict, but it established a precedent that could not be ignored. The taking of the holy city became a measure by which future actions would be judged, demonstrating that in a war defined by faith and memory, conquest could still be shaped by restraint. The capture of Jerusalem in 1187 did not conclude the conflict that had defined the Eastern Mediterranean for nearly a century. Instead, it altered the framework within which that conflict would continue. The city's fall forced both Christian and Muslim worlds to reassess assumptions about holy war, leadership, and legitimacy that had guided action for generations. What changed was not the existence of religious conflict, but the standards by which authority and victory were measured. For the Muslim world, Jerusalem's recovery represented a fulfillment long imagined but rarely realized. Yet the manner of its capture reshaped expectations. Saladin's restraint challenged the notion that holy war required uncompromising violence. His conduct demonstrated that legitimacy could be reinforced through control, order, and moral discipline rather than terror. This recalibration did not remove the religious dimension of conflict, but it reframed it. Authority derived not only from success against the enemy, but from adherence to principles that justified unity in the first place. This shift carried implications for leadership. Saladin's example elevated a model of rulership that balanced force with responsibility, piety with pragmatism. His authority rested on the perception that he governed not merely as a conqueror, but as a custodian of sacred space. This conception of power resonated within Islamic political thought, reinforcing the idea that moral conduct and strategic effectiveness were inseparable. Victory without restraint was revealed as insufficient for lasting legitimacy. Christian responses to Jerusalem's fall reflected a different recalibration. Shock and grief dominated initial reactions, amplified by the city's symbolic centrality to Christian identity. Yet alongside calls for renewed crusade, emerged recognition that the rules had changed. Jerusalem had not been lost through massacre or betrayal alone, but through strategic defeat and isolation. The city's surrender, conducted without the atrocities remembered from 1099, complicated narratives of absolute moral opposition. The enemy could no longer be dismissed as merely destructive. The Third Crusade emerged from this altered landscape. It was not simply an attempt to reverse territorial loss, but a response to a new strategic and moral reality. European leaders mobilized with renewed urgency, yet their objectives were shaped by the understanding that Jerusalem was now defended by a unified authority capable of coordination and restraint. The campaign that followed reflected this awareness, focusing on coastal strongholds and negotiated outcomes rather than direct assault on the city itself. Saladin's conduct influenced these calculations. His reputation for discipline and reliability made diplomacy a viable instrument alongside force. Truces and negotiations during the Third Crusade reflected mutual recognition of limits, a departure from earlier patterns of unrestrained confrontation. While conflict remained violent and destructive, It unfolded within boundaries shaped by precedent established at Jerusalem. War continued, but its language and expectations had shifted. Jerusalem itself assumed a new role within this evolving framework. Under Muslim control, the city was administered with attention to its diverse religious significance. Christian worship was regulated rather than eradicated, reinforcing the idea that authority over Jerusalem did not require exclusive possession of its sacred meaning. This approach stabilized governance while reinforcing Saladin's broader legitimacy. The city became a symbol not only of recovered honor, but of controlled power. Over time, Saladin's legacy grew beyond immediate military outcomes. Chroniclers on both sides grappled with the implications of his conduct, shaping narratives that emphasized character as much as conquest. In the Islamic world, he was remembered as a ruler who fulfilled obligation without excess. In Christian memory, he emerged as a formidable adversary whose restraint complicated simple moral dichotomies. These parallel memories influenced how later generations understood the possibilities and limits of holy war. The broader consequence lay in the redefinition of inevitability. Jerusalem's capture demonstrated that long-standing realities could be overturned through patience, unity, and disciplined leadership. It also showed that victory imposed enduring responsibility. Power gained without legitimacy could provoke endless resistance, while power exercised with restraint could stabilize even the most symbolically charged territories. This lesson resonated across political cultures shaped by religious conflict. The rules of war had not been abolished, but they had been recalibrated. Conquest was no longer judged solely by possession, nor legitimacy by victory alone. Conduct mattered, memory mattered, and the management of sacred space demanded more than force. These principles did not eliminate future violence, but they shaped its form and limits. As the decades passed, Jerusalem remained contested, its meaning layered and unresolved. Yet the events of 1187 continued to inform how leaders approached the city and what they believed control of it required. Saladin's actions established a benchmark against which successors were measured, whether they embraced or rejected his example. In stepping back from the immediate narrative, the significance of Jerusalem's capture becomes clearer. It was not simply the reversal of crusader conquest, but a moment that reshaped the moral and strategic vocabulary of religious war. The city was no longer merely taken, it had been redefined through the manner of its recovery. In that redefinition lay the enduring impact of Saladin's campaign, altering how history would remember power exercised under the weight of faith, memory, and consequence.